From the tranquil, rolling hills and glens of the lowlands, the towering cliffs and rocky shores, to the windswept and desolate peaks of the highlands, few other lands can claim as rugged and colourful a history as Scotland. The forces of nature have carved this land of proud heritage into one of unusual diversity, mysterious and flamboyant, rough and gloriously beautiful. From the same tapestry of history also comes the intricate weave of its people. Invasions at various times by Vikings, Irish, early Britons, Angles, Normans, Romans and others have hewn the Scots from the earliest of time. Through the ages, these prevailing and diverse influences have resulted in a melting pot of culture, language, religion, government and heritage. Elements of which not only continue in today's Scotland, but also in many other places of the world. Hello, my name is Colin Liddell. Uniquely Scottish is the influence of its clan. Literally meaning the children or descendants, the clan was the social structure of the Highland family. Typically under the leadership of a hereditary chief, the ancient clan was usually centred in a particular geographic area, and it provided an economic structure as well as functioning as a military body. Fiercely autonomous, clans too shaped Scottish culture and history. Among the many illustrious clans of Scotland, one that can trace its ancient ancestry further than almost any other is Clan Donnachaidh, or as it is more commonly known today, the Robertsons. Descending from Scottish royal blood, Clan Donnachaidh, Gaelic for Children of Duncan, also includes the proud and respected names of Duncanson, Reed, MacRobert, MacRobbie, Roberts, Inches, MacLagan, Stark, Collier, Roy, McInroy, Donnachaidh, McConaughey, McIver, and many others, making it one of the largest of all the Scottish families. With the reputation of being fierce warriors, the influence of Clan Donnachaidh has affected many of Scotland's historic battles. At one time, the ancestral clan leaders were great landowners in central Scotland. Though sometimes impetuous in nature, they often evidenced a trait of compassion for those less fortunate or those under their care. Their rebellious leaders were not immune from fleeing for their lives into exile and having their lands confiscated. Grants of clemency were often followed by further uprisings. Great scholars, artists, political leaders and warriors mixed in conflicts that remain legendary to this day. Some of these involved opponents who were not always that distant in relation. Several theories have been espoused as to the origins of the clan. In the ancient days of Scotland, or more properly Alba, the Pictish tribes of what is now Perthshire were called Caledonii. There is evidence that of these there were 5 major groups, one being Clan Donnachaidh. The Perthshire area was also associated with the more recent ancestors of the clan, and so there is some likelihood that they were patriarchs of the Donnachaidh. One of the most accepted theories of the clan's origins is that of a descent from the kindred of St Columba, who was himself of royal Irish lineage. Around 563 AD, Columba founded the ancient monastery on the Isle of Iona, and he served as an ambassador to the major political forces of the time, gaining peace to some degree between the Picts in central Scotland and the Scots from the southwest. Interestingly, it was these Scots, originally from Ireland, who gave their name to the land and its people. After leaving Iona, Columba's followers were probably influential in the establishment of the ancient abbey here at Dunkeld. On the Donnachaidh chief's coat of arms, the presence of the serpent and dove may support that link with St Columba. The ancient proverb, "Be wise as the serpent and gentle as the dove," suggests the connection, as the word dove is the translation of Columba. Most of the details of that time are now lost to the misty past, but it is said that one of Columba's descendants, Duncan, was abbot of Dull and Donnachaidh in the mid-900s. Duncan's grandson Crinan, besides being hereditary abbot of Donnachaidh, was also a prominent secular leader. He was referred to by his Norse allies as Jarl Hundi, or Chief of the Dogs. This label seems to describe his character, as he dealt fiercely with those who opposed him, yet was very accommodating to those who had power over him. From his union with Bethok, daughter of King Malcolm II, came another Duncan, who through his mother inherited the throne of Scotland. King Duncan I had 3 sons, Malcolm, Donald and Maelmhair. The eldest, Malcolm III, also known as Malcolm Can Mór, or Large Head, inherited his father's throne. Interestingly, though Malcolm's heirs come from a later marriage, he first married his own second cousin, the daughter of Thorfinn, the Norse Earl of Orkney, his father's arch-rival and cousin. By this time, the north of Scotland was ruled primarily by descendants of the same family. As we have just seen, ambition and the quest for control would occasionally pit these relatives, sometimes not all that distant, one against another. In Shakespeare's popular, but not entirely accurate story, he tells that in a rivalry for the throne, King Duncan was slain near Elgin by the order of another cousin, the legendary Macbeth. Some years later, Duncan's son Malcolm III retrieved the crown when he in turn slew Macbeth. Actually, there is evidence that suggests that Duncan was killed in a campaign against Thorfinn. In any case, the crown continued in Malcolm's family for many years. Though there are varying accounts, one of the most accepted theories is that it was Malcolm's younger brother, Maelmhair, from whom the Clan Donnachaidh would derive. Maelmhair was given a large portion of land in Atholl, and his descendants presided over the area for several generations. Maelmhair's grandson, Malcolm, Celtic Earl of Atholl, was married twice. The first union produced the heir, Henry. His second marriage was to his second cousin, Egitilda, a descendant of a royal branch. Such interwoven relationships served to perpetuate affiliation to the royal families and ensure the loyalty that was so critical in those turbulent times. Ironically, the descendants from Hextilda's own first marriage, the Cummins, would fight against the Clan Donnachaidh in the 1300s. Henry, last Celtic Earl of Atholl, was a fervent supporter of the Scottish monarchy and was active in defending his kinsman's claim to the throne. In fact, it is said that he went into great debt raising Atholl's share of the ransom for King William the Lion. From his first of 2 marriages, Henry had 1 son, Constantine, and 2 daughters. From his second marriage came another son, Conan. This second marriage was not recognised by the church, and so, after Henry's death, and as Constantine died at about the same time, and without issue, the earldom went to the families of the 2 daughters, rather than to the illegitimate Conan. Though there seems to have been some political undertones to the whole matter, Conan did receive some land in Perthshire, and was styled Lord of Glenairity. These lands, upon which his predecessors had lived for over a century, were in turn passed down to Conan's son Ewan, who with his father led the clan in support of Alexander II. Of the other lineages in contention, Ewan's son Angus was the only one who could show direct father-to-son descent from Duncan I, and so was one of the 13 claimants to the throne in 1290. It seems to have been the trio of Angus, his son Andrew, and grandson Duncan, who were particularly instrumental in the eradication of wolves in the Atholl area. For his service, Andrew received a grant of land, and also the banner consisting of 3 wolves' heads on a field of red. Duncan is typically credited with the design of the present shield, and there is some record of an even older one crested by a lone standing wolf, though its exact origin and period of use is unclear. Though the earldom had legally left the family, Duncan's father Andrew was styled de Atholier, or of Atholl, This was probably because of the landholding he still maintained in the area. Born around 1275, Duncan of Atholl, great-great-grandson of Conan of Glenerichty, and ninth-generation descendant from King Duncan I, was also known as Donnachaidh or Duncan the Stout. In addition to inheriting his father's estate, Duncan's lands were largely expanded by his two marriages. It's estimated that his holdings once extended from the Grampians on the north to the lowlands of Perthshire on the south, and from Angus on the east to Argyll on the west. The Atholl area was the strategic gateway to central Scotland, and he who held Atholl controlled that gateway. Being the landlord of such a key area, Duncan was a local leader of some prominence. He is also considered to have been one of the most redoubtable warriors of his time. Quite often, tenants or those who served or sought the protection of a powerful leader or landlord would take his name, even though there may not have been an actual blood relationship. Some retain their own names, and this is the likely origin of some of the set names of Clan Donnachaidh. So it was that this collection of people in Perthshire recognised Duncan the Stout as their leader and called themselves his people. It is from this Duncan that the name Donnachaidh is derived, and so though there have been previous leaders, it is reasonable to call him the first chief of the clan. Full of the same dramatic history as that of Scotland herself, Clan Donnachaidh had its share of intrigue. In one story, it's told that during the tumultuous period of Robert the Bruce's fight for the crown, the audacious Duncan, disguised as a beggar, sneaked into the camp of his invading arch-enemy Dougal. Being discovered, he fled the camp, pursued by his enraged foes. Though he had outrun his pursuers, he turned around and dispatched one of them, before resuming his flight. Reaching the bank of the River Ericht, Duncan leapt its some 16 feet expanse in an amazing bound, and made good his escape. This place is still traditionally called Liam Donnachaidh Reamer, or Stout Duncan's Leap. Well known for their loyalty, many times did Donnachaidh chiefs lead their kinsmen and followers in campaigns supporting the Scottish crown. True to this spirited reputation, Duncan was involved in numerous battles, some over local land and clan issues, and some concerning the very heart of Scottish sovereignty. Before battle, he would gather his men at the favourite Donnachaidh mustering place, Fay Corrie, a little stream near Trinafore in Glenerichty. Duncan was a good friend of Robert the Bruce, and sheltered the defeated contender after the Battle of Methven in 1307. It was at this time that Bruce was crowned as King of the Scots. Contending with the Balliol Cumming claim to the throne at home and the English forces of Edward I, Bruce struggled to maintain Scottish sovereignty. At the peak of the confrontation in 1314, Bruce's forces clashed with the largest English army ever sent against Scotland at the historic Battle of Bannockburn. Naturally, Duncan led his kinsmen in support of Bruce at the battle. There's a clan tradition that the young men of the regiment arrived at the battle unusually attired in light-coloured tunics. Some accounts suggest that these were obtained in an encounter with some customarily clad Welsh troops who had joined the battle against Bruce. It is said that the clan played a pivotal role in the battle, but though the Donnachaidhs were most assuredly involved, there is some speculation that in fact they arrived late to the battle. Besides Duncan's receiving a charter of his lands and later accepting an offer of the earldom of Atholl, one element of Clan Donnachaidh's law that seems to support at least their attendance at Bannockburn is a small stone known as the Clach na Bracach. On the morning of the battle, Duncan rallied his men. As his standard was pulled from the ground, he noticed a glittering something in a clod of earth, clinging to the flagstaff. he raised up the stone to his followers, proclaiming to them that he was sure its brilliant lights were a good omen and foretold their victory, which they did indeed achieve. After Bannockburn, the charm, actually a piece of rock crystal, was always carried into battle by the Robertson chiefs. The tradition followed that this stone of the standard was said to foretell the success of the Donnachaidh chiefs. Duncan's sons carried on his reputation as fighters. His son Robert succeeded him in 1355 and led the clan in a number of risings. Robert was the largest estate owner of any of the later clan chiefs, and his half-brothers, Patrick and Thomas, would prove to be the progenitors respectively of the Robertsons of Lude and the Reeves of Strelloch. It was these two who led the clan in the famous Raid of Angus. As the story goes, the family had some disagreement with a nephew, Sir David Lindsay. This dispute seems to have been over some land in Angus, which had been lost to Lindsay through marriage. In 1392, under the leadership of Robert's three half-brothers, and with the help of Sir Duncan Stewart and his followers, a small army of clansmen paid a visit one night to the Lindsays. Making their way eastward into Angus, the some 300 wild Highlanders, armed with claymore, targe and dirk, descended on the Lindsay and Ogilvie houses. They captured hundreds of their victims' cattle and drove them back towards Rannoch. The men of Angus had mustered and made 2 attempts to avenge this ruthless raid. The Angus men first caught up with the raiders near Blairgowrie, where they took heavy losses in a bloody battle. Though inferior in number, the Angus men, with additional support of Sir Walter Ogilvie and some 70 fully armoured horsemen, rallied for the second time at Dalnagairn and engaged in a ferocious and savage battle. The Angus forces again suffered great casualties. Lindsay himself was injured by a raider who, though run through by Lindsay's lance, pulled himself up the lance and slashed right through Lindsay's armoured boot, nearly severing his foot. Defeated, the Angus men retreated. But not content with their victories, the raiders followed, slaughtering yet more of the Angus forces. For their involvement in the massacre, Patrick and Thomas were declared outlaws. The chief was forfeited of all titles and lands, and had to be forced to surrender his lands of Rannoch. During the late 14th century, clans were beginning to take on a more cohesive form, and to function as social and political, as well as military units. Generally, they had evolved as a tribal system, based around a particular hereditary leader. Also, the developing patronymic custom began to influence the existing surname, de Atholia. Though that name still remained in official use for many years, the chiefs of the clan and many of their descendants gradually became commonly known as Donnachaidh or Duncanson. As we shall see shortly, the fourth chief, also named Robert, was a prominent figure, and most consider him to be the source of the name Robertson. It is important to note here that Robert or Duncan were not uncommon names, and that taking one's surname from his father's given name was the practice of the time. Therefore, all Robertsons or Duncansons are not necessarily descended from Clan Donnachaidh. However, the cadet families of Struan did become widely scattered, being found near Inverness to the north, and as far south as Berwickshire, near the English border. The second chief, called Robert Ruard because of his red hair, passed the chieftainship to his son Duncan. It is from this time that the name Robertson began to be more commonly used. Born around 1392, the third chief was Lord of Rannoch. Through his marriage to his cousin, daughter of his uncle Thomas of Athol, he gained the ancestral lands of Struan, which would become the future family seat. Duncan's youngest son, also named Duncan, moved north to Inches and established the Robertsons of that area. Upon the chief's death in 1432, the position passed to his oldest son, known as Robert Riach, or Grizzled Robert. The surname of this, the fourth chief, appears separately as de Atholia, Duncanson, and Robertson. He was also referred to as Struan, this being taken from the name of his estate and seat. Located at the junction of the Garry and Erchty rivers, Struan, which means place of streams, appropriately describes the beautiful surroundings of the Perthshire countryside. The mountain of Schiehallion, or Fairy Hill, was a special place for local clansmen, and there is some interesting folklore and superstition surrounding the mount. Likewise, there are several legends about stones and wells in the area. Superstition had it that from toothache to whooping cough, all manner of afflictions could be remedied by sitting on a certain stone or washing in the water of a particular well. The saddle stone, for example, was the answer in the case of infertility, and a dip in the waters of St. Fillan's Well, near Struan Kirk, was the cure for lunacy. Robert Rioch was greatly feared by the Lowlanders, upon whom he frequently raided. It has been said, tongue-in-cheek, that he was one of the finest competitors in the sport of cattle stealing. This Robert added a great deal to the reputation and position of the clan. The most notable event associated with this chief dates to 1437, when he is said to have apprehended the murderers of King James I. Having committed the treasonous act on the orders of the king's own chamberlain, Sir Robert Stewart, the ambitious Sir Robert Graham and others fled to Athol, presumably to seek the protection of the aged Earl of Athol. Before they could make their escape, the regicides were captured by the Donnachaidh chief in a lonely glen near Blair Athol, now called Old Gramach. Robert took Graham and the others, including the Earl, to the authorities. Thereafter they were taken to Edinburgh and summarily hanged, drawn and quartered. As King James II was but 6 years of age at the time, rival factions attempted to rule Scotland in his name, often promoting their own interests. For the next 12 years, as he matured, James II became determined to right the situation. In acknowledgement for capturing his father's murderers, he erected Robert's lands into a free barony, confirming him in the possession of his estates, thus giving him direct administrative control over them, answerable only to the king. The charter, granted on 15th August 1451, named the chief's estates Struan, Balnagard, Invervac, Fascally, Carry, Granach, Glengarry, Glen Erchty, half of Ranach, and several others. This was a strategic position, for, as Baron of the region, the chief had the official power to adjudicate local civil and criminal disputes. It was also the Baron's responsibility to provide his tenants with basic necessities, such as a mill, a brew house, and a smithy. He did, however, have somewhat of a monopoly, as the tenants were required to take their business to the mill and to pay what was asked. James II also made several augmentations to the chief's coat of arms. Above the shield, with its 3 wolves' heads, was added the crest of a right hand holding up an imperial crown, whilst below, a wild man bound in chains was introduced, supposedly representing the captured Sir Robert Graham. The serpent and dove supporters date from this time, and in addition, the motto, Virtutis Gloria Merces, or Glory is the reward of valour, was given. The coat of arms still remains today, and is the personal property of the chief. The crest, when surrounded by strap and buckle, however, may be displayed by any clan member. It is uncertain when the Robertson war cry, Gargan ver Dusker, first came into use, but this chief provided a fine example of its meaning, fierce when roused. On occasion, some of the Highland chiefs were known to take the law, or their interpretation of it, into their own hands. Robert was a good example of this somewhat dubious tradition, and was wont to raid from time to time on persons with whom he took exception. In one such outing, Robert rallied the clan against Robert Forrester of Torwood. Forrester had been granted the lands of Little Dunkeld by his uncle, the Bishop of Dunkeld, but the Donnachaidh chief considered them to be historically and rightfully his, and so he led his clan in a raid to reclaim them. It's relayed through a traditional story that, on his way to accept the confirmation of his charter in 1460, Robert was mortally wounded in an accidental encounter with Forrester at Ardonnachaidh, southeast of Ochtergaven church. Apparently, Forrester was still smarting over the earlier clan raid. Unlike his adversary, Robert survived the duel, but suffered a deep wound to his head. Obviously a tenacious fellow, he bound himself up and rode in his bloody state to appear before the king. After the arduous return home to Struan with the charter, he soon died from the fateful wound. Robert's death was avenged by the clan later that year, when they happened to be in the neighbourhood, whilst en route to fight with King James II at the siege of Roxburgh. Any advantages that the fifth chief provided for the clan were doubtless nullified when, in 1513, William, the sixth chief, was dispossessed of a large portion of the Struan barony, including his island home on Loch Tummel. In restitution for non-payment of a sizable debt, King James V transferred the title of the estate to the Earl of Atholl. As described by the Earl, William Robertson was an insolent person that played the despot. And although William no doubt suffered from the loss of his lands, it was not long before he also lost his life, beheaded at the hands of Atholl's adherents. By the late 1500s, the ninth chief had even less land to oversee. His predecessors had lost a large portion of the barony, including the Black Castle of Invervac, owing to debt and poor management. The Highlands themselves were in a general state of turmoil during this time. In 1587, James VI tried to bring order by making clan chiefs legally responsible for the good behaviour of their tenants and clansmen, and for producing wrongdoers for trial if required. This was no small challenge for the chief of Clan Donnachaidh, as the clan had become both large and widely scattered. Several cadet branches had become prominent families in their own right, including the Robertsons of Fascally, Ochleeks, Lude, and the Reed Robertsons in Straloch. Likewise, the clan had been interconnected by marriage to several other Scottish families, such as the Earls of Atholl and Errol, the Mingies of Ween, Drummonds, Campbells of Breadorban, Fergusons of Pitlochry, Stewarts, and many others. It was at this time, when a single chief controlled such a large number of people, that the clan system truly reached its height. Robert, the 10th chief, saw some of the previously forfeited lands returned to his family. His half-brother, John Robertson, a merchant in Edinburgh, had acquired the lands and gave them back to the new chief in 1604. This chief is said to have saved Perth from being sacked after the Battle of Tibbermore in 1644. In 1612, a very important meeting of all the heads of the family branches was held at the 10th chief's home. Struan, Alexander Robertson of Lude, Alexander, 7th Baron Reed, the Robertsons of Manee, Fascally, Dalcapen and others, all took an oath to their kinsman, Earl of Errol, Lord High Constable, that they would band Clan Donnachaidh to their chief, and concur and assist the said Laird of the Struan, maintain and help his house and estate, as far as possible we can be able. Though other branches had become powerful forces and had achieved measurable influence, this oath confirmed Struan as the leader of the whole clan, and in general assured its cohesiveness. This Robert had 4 sons, and in 1630, 6 years before his death, he resigned his estate and titles to the eldest, Alexander. Before this time, the typical Scottish Highlander attire was more or less a long shirt or tunic, which, incidentally, was sometimes shed as the warrior rushed into battle. Around the early 1500s, the tunic began to be replaced by the belted plaid, a length of Brecon or check fabric wrapped around the waist with the end draped over the shoulder. The feilibeg or little kilt, which is more commonly worn today, developed sometime in the late 1700s. There is some debate as to when distinct tartan patterns or sets first appeared, but it is safe to assume that some existed by the mid-1700s, most after 1784, and even most of these differ in appearance from those in use today. Clan identification by tartan, however, was not really in evidence until sometime after 1800. Within Clan Donnachaidh there are now several tartans and a number of variations. In general, the green-based or darker patterns are referred to as hunting tartans, whilst the red or lighter colours are called dress. The more common Robertson tartans are the red dress, dating from about 1820, which is both an ancient and a modern variation, and the hunting, an older set with ancient, modern and weathered styles. The distinction of ancient or modern is not actually a difference in pattern, but is due to the improvement in colour fast dyes. From the time the sets actually existed, the chiefs of the clan have worn the Robertson tartans, but some of the other branches developed their own. Other Clan Donnachaidh tartans include Duncan and McInroy. Alexander Robertson of Struan was only an infant when he succeeded his father as 12th chief. Owing to Alexander's minority, his uncle Donald, known as the Tutor of Struan, took the lead as head of the clan. Being the son of a chief himself, the Tutor was well suited as a leader. Loyal to the Stuart monarchy, he led some 800 of the clan in support of Charles I. It has been claimed that he was out with the clan in all the campaigns of his maternal kinsman, the Marquis of Montrose. Current evidence indicates, however, that the clan was out in only one. In his fervour, he committed nearly all of the clan's assets to his cause and exposed many of his clansmen to financial hardship. In 1653, when he was sufficiently grown, Alexander led the clan in the royalist Glencairn's rising. Probably as a consequence for taking part in the skirmish, the castle at Invervac was burnt, as was the house of the Robertsons of Lude. Alexander is described as a man of high honour and independent character. Perhaps in an effort to ease tension between his family and the Earl of Athol, he proved formally the validity of his ancestry. For a time this settled the matter, and Athol disputed no longer the chief's rightful title to his lands. Alexander died in 1688, just before the era of the Jacobite rebellions. This was the beginning of a pivotal period in Scotland's turbulent history. Religious issues were dividing the country, and some clans even experienced dissension from within. Baron Reed of Strelach, for example, was firmly Presbyterian and found himself in opposition to his own Episcopalian or Catholic Robertson cousins. Supporting the deposed Stuart king, James VII of Scotland and II of England, the Robertsons were part of the Jacobite forces. On and off between 1689 and 1746, these forces fought hard to return the Stuart lineage to the throne of Britain. Brave warriors charged into battle, bellowing their war cries. Clansmen rallied under their chief's banner, and though not all Scots were on the Jacobite side of the conflict, nevertheless, this was one of the rare times that clans united for a common cause. The 13th chief, another Alexander, is again one of the chiefs about whom there are several stories. He perpetuated the tradition that the Robertsons were fighters. In fact, it's said that he may have been the only man in Scotland to have been active in the three major Jacobite uprisings of 1689, 1715 and 1745. His younger brother Duncan was also a famous soldier and served as a colonel in the army of Peter the Great in Russia. Born in 1668 and being a younger son, Alexander was originally intended for the church and was educated at St Andrews University. But in 1688, he left his studies to lead the clan. He supported the forces of John Graham of Claverhouse, popularly known as Bonnie Dundee. Being captured at the Jacobite defeat at Dunkeld in 1689, and refusing to swear allegiance to the new king, William of Orange, Alexander's estates were confiscated. He was traded for another prisoner and released, after which he fled to France, a route repeated on several occasions both by himself and future clan leaders. He spent the next 13 years in exile, often in the company of King James at Saint-Germain. Still not able to pass up a fight, he served in the French army in support of Louis XIV, probably because it was the only way he could make a living. For the years that he was away, the clan was led by Alexander's sister, known as Black Margaret, with aid from the Donnachaidh branch of the family. It would be through this branch, descended from the 10th chief's third son, Duncan Moore of Donnachaidh, known for his great strength and stature, that the line of the chiefs of the clan would eventually continue. In 1702, at Margaret's solicitation, Queen Anne granted Alexander a remission, and he soon returned to his home at Donnachaidh in Rannoch. However, not having completely regained title to his former estates upon the Queen's death in 1714, his enemies took advantage of his situation and eventually drove him from his home. He retired to Carry on the south side of Loch Rannoch. He was out again in 1715 with the Earl of Mar and brought 250 men to join with the rest of the clan, led by Duncan Moore's son, Alexander of Donnachaidh. On the eve of the Battle of Sheriff Muir, he discovered a flaw in the Clach na Bratach, the stone of the standard found by Duncan the Stout. The superstition was held that so long as it remained undamaged and in his possession, the Struan chief and those whom he supported would have success in their campaigns. Alexander therefore took the flaw as a sign of impending disaster. Indeed, he was captured during the battle, and the estate and the fortune of Struan has declined ever since. In a daring attempt, his kinsman Robert Ban Robertson of Invervac temporarily rescued the chief. Being captured again after the battle, he was sent off to Edinburgh for trial. But before Alexander reached his apparent fate, his sister came to his rescue and allowed him to escape to France for a second time. Around 1725, with the assistance of kinsman Earl of Portmore, Margaret yet again came to her brother's aid when she petitioned and received his pardon from King George I, granted with the stipulation that the lands would not be restored to him, but to Margaret. Soon after her brother's return home from exile, Margaret died, and title to the estates was held for Alexander's heir, though he did himself administer them for a while. Alexander was quiet for 18 years. But in 1745, he was out again with 700 of his followers, supporting King James VII and II's grandson, Prince Charles Edward, also known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, in his contention for the crown. Incidentally, only some 200 of the chief's followers were actually residents of the estates, showing the wide breadth of his following. Though 77 years old at the time, Alexander was present at the Battle of Preston Pans. Age getting the better of him, he returned to Carry, leaving Donald Robertson of Wood Shield, son of Robert Ban Robertson, to continue leading the clan to their short-lived victory. The way in which he retired to Carry is a fine example of his audacity and inimitable style. The elderly chief made his way back home, riding in the captured carriage and clad in the fur coat of the defeated General Cope. This met with great applause from his cadre. The carriage did pose one small problem, however, as there were no proper roads leading to the chief's residence. Undaunted, his clansmen lifted their chief in his splendid new carriage up to their shoulders and carried him the remainder of the way. His retainers remain in Bonnie Prince Charlie's army and were incorporated into the Athol Brigade. In 1746, the Clan Duncan men, under the command of Donald Robertson of Wood Shield, suffered badly, with many other clans, at the bloody Battle of Culloden. Many hundreds of Scots lay dead on the battlefield. Many of those who managed to escape the field of battle were hunted down and killed, whilst others who had been captured were expelled from the country, many perishing en route. With Bonnie Prince Charlie's own flight to France, the Stuart campaign for the Crown of Britain was over for good. In the aftermath of Culloden, the Scottish clan system would be changed forever. Tartan and kilts were outlawed. The chief's baronial courts were abolished. their lands were confiscated and they began losing their influence over their people. One interesting tale from the time of the last rebellion relates to Robert Van Robertson of Invervac, the rescuer of the 13th chief. In the autumn of 1745, this lone Robert covertly observed 9 government troops as they crossed the Tummel Bridge on their way to Inverness. Stopping for a short rest, they broke rank and rested their guns against a large boulder. Seeing an opportunity to get even with some redcoats, Robert, armed only with gun, pistolet and broadsword, positioned himself between the soldiers and their weapons and stated that they were surrounded and demanded their surrender. By the time the troops realized the ruse, Robert had made his getaway, taking all of their weapons with him. This tray of tempting fate seems to be somewhat of a legacy, passed down from the days of Duncan the Stout and beyond. A man of broad character, Alexander Robertson of Struan was famous not only for his military endeavours, but also for his artistic ones. Besides being a renowned leader and soldier, he was also an accomplished poet and a classical scholar. In fact, he is most often referred to as the Poet Chief. He compiled a small volume of poems which was published after his death. His work is fairly varied, including some humorous and satirical pieces, as well as a few religious and secular songs. Most had strong Jacobite overtones. It's mentioned that he left his mark on the clan by introducing a white line into the traditional Robertson tartan, so as to distinguish the set of the chief and his family. This is, however, a little too early for distinct clan tartans. He also left his mark on the clan lands in that he seems to have been rather careless and indiscriminate about cutting down the trees in the Black Wood of Rannoch. He also led several hunts in an attempt to eliminate the redeveloping wolf population in Rannoch. He died unmarried but well loved in 1749 and was buried in the family tomb at Struan Church. It is said that there were some 2,000 people in attendance at his funeral. Funerals then were often a time of celebration. Dancing, drinking and singing were common in the all-night vigils, and with a zeal for merrymaking equalled only by that for battle, things could occasionally get out of hand. Though it's not mentioned of the poet chief's funeral, one wintry night in the 18th century, Charles Robertson of Auchleeks fell through the frozen Loch Tummel and drowned whilst mourning. With the poet chief leaving no direct descendant, the line of the chiefs took a jump to Duncan Robertson of Donnachaidh, great-grandson of the previously mentioned Duncan Moore of Donnachaidh. The lands of Donnachaidh, north of Dunalister and Kinloch Rannoch, had been acquired from the Apple family by Duncan Moore, though previously it had been a Struan possession. This, the 14th chief, was very different from his predecessors, and is described as being a man of retiring habits and devout piety. However, though forced from ill health from actively participating, he too was involved in the rebellions, and for his involvement he was specifically excluded in the 1747 Act of Indemnity, and in 1752 was dispossessed. Almost a tradition now, this chief also took refuge in France, taking his wife and 3 children with him. It seems that he remained there for the rest of his life. Though the chief was not there to see it personally, many of his clansmen were experiencing difficult times. The Highland economy was becoming ever more dependent on money, rather than the exchange of goods or services, and outdated farming practices could not compete with the profitable sheep industry. The clan system, though it created a great deal of civil unrest, had served to promote the welfare of its kinsmen. With this support system gone, and as the government forces gradually took control during the 18th and 19th centuries, Scottish life began to change again. In order to suppress the rebellious clans, and in an attempt to homogenise the economy, many Scots, particularly Highlanders, were involuntarily redistributed to other areas. Later, many were forced to leave their homes to make room for the black-faced sheep being brought into the area. During these clearances, though Struan himself never enforced them, thousands relocated to the lowlands. Many took the road south into England, where some stayed and some continued on to the continent. Large numbers left their homeland by sea, making their way to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and elsewhere. Without the rents from these tenants, even chiefs found it more and more difficult to maintain their lands. Another Alexander Robertson, Duncan's eldest son, was the next chief of the clan, although he lived most of his life away from Scotland. The previously confiscated estates of Struan were restored to him in 1784. Unfortunately, he also regained the debts of the estate dating back to 1690. Around the turn of the 18th century, he built a house on the former site of the poet chief's hermitage of Dunalister. On 20th September 1820, he executed an entail on the whole of the remainder of the estates in favour of the male heirs of the family. It also appears that he had the fighting spirit, though it was expressed in a more politically acceptable manner, serving the American War as a colonel in the British service. Incidentally, it was his younger brother Walter who apparently adopted the name Collier. The Reed membership of the clan originates from the early 15th century marriage of Matilda Duncanson, daughter of the first chief's son Thomas, to her red or reed-haired cousin Alexander Ruer, son of Duncan the Stout's son Patrick. The Reeds held the lands of Strathdal in Perthshire from the 1400s and held the barony of Strelach until the end of the 18th century. The last Reed Baron of Strelach was General John Reed, who, as with other clan leaders, was active in the arts as well as the military. Though born with the surname Robertson, he officially adopted the name Reed, perhaps from the old family traditional name. He was educated at the University of Edinburgh and served with the famous 42nd Highlanders. He was a landowner in New York until the American Revolution, and was also a composer, having written several musical pieces, the most famous of which is the tune to the regimental march, The Garb of Old Gaul, set when he was an officer in the 42nd. He was such a lover of music that he willed most of his fortune to create a large endowment for the chair of theory of music at Edinburgh University. He also made some additions to the library there. Other music related to the clan, though perhaps not actually composed by a member, include Salute to the Laird of Struan, Blue Ribbon, Robertson's Rant, and a few others. Also associated with the Robertsons of Lude, the motto, "Dinna waken a sleeping dog," comes perhaps from a reference to the ferocity with which they went into battle. From that time, many Highland Scots began serving the developing British Empire and formed regiments of high regard. There was a volunteer clan regiment for local defence raised in 1795, which was commanded by a Robertson of Lude. The renowned 42nd Highlanders, also known as the Black Watch, was recruited largely from the Perthshire Highlands. Many of the chief's successors and other members of the family became professional soldiers, a career which drew them further and further away from their lands and their clansmen. As I mentioned, from the time of the third chief, several other cadet families had become landowners. The Robertsons of Fascally were descendants of the sixth chief's brother and had held the barony of Fascally since 1599. The estate of Fascally was sold in 1770. The Robertsons of Auchleeks descended from John Robertson of Calveen, with Donald Robertson becoming the first laird of Auchleeks around 1530. In fact, in 1826, Auchleeks bought part of the Struan estates, and by 1830 he owned the bulk of Glen Erechty. In Strelach, the Reed Robertsons had descended from Thomas of Athol in the early 1400s. The Baron Reed of Strelach sold his estate in 1778. The Robertsons of Inches, also originating in the mid-1400s, were successful merchants in the Inverness area. Their property was sold in 1772 owing to lost investments in Central America. The Robertsons of Candice came from this branch in the mid-1600s. The oldest Clan Donnachaidh cadet family was the Robertsons of Lude. The Lude estate, held since 1448, was sold to McInroy in 1821. And it's through the Lude family that the Robertson harp comes, originally belonging to the wife of the 7th chief. One strange similarity among some of the members of these families is that they often share the hereditary malformation of the fingers, known as crooked crannies. Recent surveys have shown that in Scotland alone, there are approximately 45,000 people of names affiliated with the clan. Though the clan system had come to an end, the Clan Donnachaidh continued to meet on a social basis. The next and 16th chief, Captain Alexander Robertson, presided over a festival of the Clan Donnachaidh in 1823, which was held in order to nourish and preserve the true spirit of friendship and attachment of clan members. His predecessor leaving no son, Alexander, the great-grandson of Duncan Moore of Donnachaidh's younger son Donald, also served in the British Army and fought in the American War of Independence. He was nicknamed the Slim Captain and was apparently the last chief to carry the Clach na Bratach and treat it as a magical charm. As tales of its magic became widely known throughout the clan, kinsmen would come from miles around to be healed by the stone's mysterious power. On one occasion, Alexander reportedly dipped the stone with ceremonious gravity in a bowl of water drawn from a fairy spring, and then distributed it amongst the visiting clansmen. Whether or not they were truly healed, there is no record. Alexander's eldest son from his first marriage succeeded him in 1830, but not before he saw the sale of Invervac at public auctions to the Duke of Atholl in 1826. As the political forces of the country wrestled with change, so too did the landscape of the countryside. As previously mentioned, the once common wolves were no longer found in Perthshire by the 1740s. The Black Wood of Rannoch is one of the few remaining examples of the once vast Caledonian forest. Monuments stand over former fields of war. Once mighty castles and buildings, even villages, either sacked or broken with the ravages of time, are represented, if at all, by indistinguishable rubble. The decline in the clan's prosperity over the years is well illustrated. Of the 20 buildings that stood over the original site of the castle of Invervac in 1750, only 2 remained by 1841. Today, all that remains of the Robertson of Struan corn mill there is a lone millstone. In the 1980s, some of the old houses on Marrick Rocht were lost not to debt nor crown, but were conquered by the Highway Department after making the modern road through Perthshire. Even so, if wandering around the heart of Clan country, one can see a small number of buildings which, in the past, had belonged to some of the other family branches. The House of Ochleeks, though a newer house was built in front of it around 1820, displays the Struan coat of arms above the front door. There were Robertsons still living in the house until as recently as the 1960s. Tom Moor, the knoll of the Great House near Struan Kirk, is probably the oldest remnant of the early Donnachaidh dwelling places. It is now only recognisable by the artificial mound upon which it sat. Clan leaders had a house on a man-made island in the northwest part of Loch Tummel. Dating from the time of Duncan the Stout, that structure, albeit shown on a map of the Earldom of Atholl in 1860, was entirely submerged when Loch Tummel was raised as part of a hydroelectricity scheme in 1950. From the 1600s, the chiefs of the clan have lived in a number of places. The castle at Invervac was one of the main residences of the Struan chiefs until it was burnt by Cromwell's troops around 1650. Even so, They lived in a few smaller, undamaged buildings into the late 18th century. Carry, on the south shore of Loch Rannoch, was used before and after 1700. That house was burnt in 1716 and again in 1746, after the Jacobite uprisings, but was rebuilt shortly thereafter. Donnachaidh, built by the poet chief in view of Schiehallion, was his ordinary residence in 1714. It was burnt in 1746, and by 1796 there was no trace of it. The hermitage, as the poet chief called it, was often the subject of his poems. It is said that he suffered no creature to be killed in his park of Mount Alexander. In 1796, the 14th chief began building a new house on the site, but it again was burnt in the mid-1850s. Very little of any of these buildings still stand today. The 18th chief, George Duncan Robertson, succeeded to the chieftainship in 1842. Another very difficult time for his people. Owing to further economic changes, many clansmen faced dire financial difficulties. In 1854, in order to relieve the hardship of his distraught kinsmen, he broke the 15th chief's entail of 1820 and sold Donnachaidh to General John MacDonald, who built the present house in 1858. He did, however, reserve the perpetual right for burial in the family cemetery for succeeding chiefs and their families forever. Shortly after the sale of Donnachaidh, George built himself this mansion house at Dal, on the south shore of Loch Rannoch, west of Carry. This building was sold within only 6 years and is now part of Rannoch School. George also later sold the house at Carry. It is reported that George was well known in Edinburgh, though he seldom visited there. He was described as manly, athletic, agile, a beard as black as an Arab sheikh's, with a stern and powerful look as of an eagle. With keen military instincts, he was in the 42nd Highlanders when young, and it is said that he was a fine shot and a humane sportsman. He lived amongst his clansmen at Rannoch Barracks. Once again, the line of the chief took a jump when George died in 1864 without an heir. Though some of the earlier chiefs had not lived on their hereditary lands, the next in line took the family head far from home. The next to take the role as leader of the clan was the 18th chief's half-uncle, Alexander Gilbert Robertson, in 1864. Born in Scotland, he was the eldest son of the 16th chief's second wife, Jean Stewart of Fincastle. Neither expecting himself nor any of his descendants to be heirs to the chiefship, Alexander, later the 19th chief, along with his younger brother, Robert Joseph Robertson, emigrated to Jamaica around 1828. Beginning as planters, they gradually established landholdings and became more prominent in the local society, eventually acquiring the estates of Belcour and Mount Friendship. Beginning his family late in life, at the age of 58, he had 2 children, Alistair Stewart and Jean Rosine. After several years, Alexander returned with his family to Scotland to take possession of Rannoch Barracks. He died in 1884, passing the Struan title to his son Alistair. The house of Rannoch Barracks, located at the west end of Loch Rannoch, had been originally built in 1751 as a stronghold to house the forces assigned to keep down the troublesome clan uprisings. Ironically, it was this place that became the seat of 2 of the clan chiefs, as well as the last estate actually held by the Donnachaidh chiefs. The 20th chief, Alistair Stewart Robertson of Struan, was born and educated in Jamaica and succeeded his father after they had moved back to Scotland. By this time, nearly all the estates once held by the chiefs had either been taken away by the crown or sold. Alistair, described as fair-haired and lovable, saw more hard times fall on the clan lands. Though he had, on his death in 1910, left Rannoch Barracks to his sister Jean Rosine, she was eventually forced to sell the last of the ancestral Clan Donnachaidh lands in 1926 in order to clear heavy debts inherited from the 18th chief. The Jamaican properties were also sold, thus ending the property ownership legacy of the chief. In addition to dying unmarried and without heir, Alistair was the last chief to date to be buried in the family burial ground at Donnachaidh. Though he wasn't confirmed as 21st chief until 1936, the next head of the clan, George Duncan Robertson, was the grandson of Robert Joseph Robertson, brother of the 19th chief. He was born in 1868, educated in Jamaica, and eventually, after a distinguished career in the colonial civil service, became Mayor of Kingston. Langton George Duncan Haldane Robertson, 22nd chief, was, like his father, born and lived his entire life in Jamaica. Born in 1898, he was 50 years old when he succeeded his father, but he didn't become recognised as chief until a few years later. Having sufficiently demonstrated his lineage, he was confirmed as chief in October 1958. Senior history master and head of the Department of Social Studies at Knox College, he was noted as an authority on the Caribbean. Though he visited Scotland only twice, it is apparent that he cared a great deal for his clansmen. In 1977, he was ordained a priest of the Church of England in Jamaica. He died in 1983 at the age of 85, and his ashes were buried in the ancestral plot at Struan Kirk. There his headstone reads, "The chief who came home from a distant place." From his marriage to Laurel Constance Lindo, he was survived by 4 children, daughters Glory Laurel, Faith Maureen, and Margaret Jean, and his son Alexander Gilbert, who until the time of his father's death was styled of Donnachaidh. This designation had become a custom of the heir dating back to the time of the 14th chief, Duncan Robertson of Donnachaidh. Alexander Gilbert Haldane Robertson of Struan is the current and 23rd chief of the ancient Clan Donnachaidh. Though he is the 4th generation of chiefs to have been born in Jamaica, he returned to his ancestral homeland in 1957 to study engineering at Edinburgh University. He decided to remain in Britain, as did his sisters Faith and Jean. In 1965, he married Bridget Mary Kenyon, and they had 3 children, Katriana, Alistair, and Elena. The family currently owns and operates an apple orchard and market garden in Kent. As well as being the hereditary head of the clan, he has also been active in supporting the Clan Duncan Society, promoting clan affiliation and fellowship. He has fostered a special camaraderie on his visits to Australia, Canada, and the United States. Heir to the chiefship, Gilbert's son Alistair is today styled as his father before him, Robertson of Donnachaidh, younger of Struan. He was educated at the University of Glasgow and has been quite involved in clan activities at home and abroad. In 1893, the Clan Duncan Society was formed in order to perpetuate the clan affiliations and support that had dwindled once clansmen and women moved away from their Highland homes. On a very wintry January night in Edinburgh, a meeting was held in which the goals of the society were presented, namely, fostering of the clan sentiment, the cultivation of social intercourse among members, the rendering of assistance to deserving clansmen, the encouragement of education, and the collecting and preserving of records and traditions bearing on the history of the clan. Presided over by the 20th chief and attended by several members of family branches as well as other interested clan members, this inaugural meeting marked the beginning of the next era of the clan. By 1914, there were nearly 550 members worldwide, and the society provided opportunities for many members to discover a deeper understanding of the clan's history. There was a lull in society activity after that time, but in 1948 it was revitalized, and the new goal of purchasing a house in clan country was added to the previous objective. In 1969, the Clan Duncan Museum was opened at Brewer, near Blair Athol. Built on grounds purchased from the Duke of Athol, the museum is supported by donations from clansmen and other benevolent funds. It is open from April to October and houses many of the relics, historical documents and publications related to the clan. Since 1951, the Clan Annual has kept society members informed of clan issues and has served as a valuable resource for those interested in clan history, particularly for members who do not have the opportunity to visit the Athol area. With the formation of society branches worldwide, the membership has grown today to more than 2,000. In grand style, the Clan Donnachaidh Society celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1993, when several clan members from across the globe visited their ancestral homeland, many for the first time. Recently, a group of clansmen purchased the deed to the burial site at Donnachaidh, bequeathing it to the society. The society has come to the aid of clan members in need and has made several contributions to Struan Kirk. This church, located in Old Struan, was built in 1828 on the site of a much older one erected before 1600. A spiritual centre for some time, there is mention of a religious site there from before the 13th century. At one time it's said that the kirk served every mansion house and farm, from Strathtummel to Dalnaspittle. Though it has seen a number of renovations, the church is still active and annually has a special service for the people upon whose ancestral land it sits. With such tenacious ancestors, it's no wonder that over the years, numerous clansmen and women have gained some measure of renown and have contributed to the betterment of society, both within Scotland and worldwide. Doctors, educators, soldiers, poets, craftsmen, businessmen, explorers, politicians, actors, publishers, commercial contractors, musicians, statesmen, authors, painters, athletes, and people from nearly every profession imaginable have all risen from the ranks of the Donnachaidh. Although nothing of Duncan the Stout's estates remained to his descendants, many have inherited his unique character, the traits of loyalty, sympathy with the oppressed, and a loath of the oppressor, a touch of an intrepid attitude, and strong conviction are evident in many of his progeny. And though spread throughout the world and widely diverse in individuality, however well known or common, the lineage of this reflection of Scotland's own evolution continues to take pride in its heritage of the children of Duncan.
I hope you've enjoyed this video showing us the land of our ancestors and the places important to the history of Clan Donnachaidh. We are a very ancient clan, going back through the first chief in the 14th century to the kings of Scotland and the coming of Christianity to Scotland. Today we have a strong clan society with branches all over the world and a museum in Perthshire, Scotland. The society gives many members of the clan an opportunity of meeting together and sharing their common heritage.